Hello everyone. In this video, we'll see how to generate a sample sales report by using some sales data that we have. So in this Excel file, we have sales information for different items. The first column specifies the date on which the order was placed, followed by the region from which the order was placed. Then we have manager and salesman information who are responsible for the sales of that particular item. And then we have the number of units of a given item that were part of the order, and then the last column specifies the price of each unit of a particular item. We have a sample sales report here. Let's see what are the different components of this report. For any report, it's always a good practice to start with a summary section that gives a brief overview of the data that we have, and by also highlighting some important observations or the key insights that we obtain from our data. We can see here that we have 5 items that are sold across 3 regions, and in total we have 11 salesmen working under 4 managers. Next, we provide some more quantitative information about our dataset, such as the total units that were sold and the total sales amount that was generated. We also mention the average number of units sold and the average sales amount. We end our summary section by specifying the highest and lowest units that were sold and the highest and lowest sales amount that was generated. In order to make this report more comprehensive, we could add further details here, such as who was the best performing salesman in terms of sales amount generated or the number of units sold. We could also talk about the best performing region, and we could also mention the best performing manager under whom we had the highest sales. In terms of quarters, by using the order dates, we could also try to identify which were our best performing quarters and which were the worst performing quarters. But for this exercise, this basic information should be enough. Next, we have a couple of trend lines here. So the first one shows the trend of number of units sold by order. So we have data starting from the earliest order date and then to the latest order date. This graph may not be as informative because it doesn't highlight any pattern here. We don't see the units increasing or decreasing, so this graph may not be as informative, so we can just ignore it. Next graph, which is the sales amount by the order date, probably gives a little more insight into our data here. So we can see that we did comparatively well in the first and second quarters of 2018, but then our sales dropped towards the third and fourth quarter here, whereas they picked up again in the first and second quarter of 2019, but they dropped again during the third quarter. So this might be a very useful insight because it helps us to understand in which quarters we have performed well, in which quarters we have not performed as well, and we might try to troubleshoot more, to dig more into our data and into our business processes to try to understand why our sales slump during the third quarter. Next, we have analysis broken down by different entities. So in our dataset, we have information on regions, managers, salesmen, and item. So say we wanted to compare different regions. If we wanted to study how we are performing across different regions, then we can break down our analysis by regions as shown here. So in this table, we can see for each region how many managers are responsible and how many salesmen are working in those regions, how many items are being sold, and what were the total units and total sales amount that was generated in each of those regions. Next, with the help of these two pie charts, we can see that the central region is performing exceedingly well when compared to the other two regions. The next entity of analysis was item. So in this table, we can see for each item, what was the unit price, how many units were sold, and what was the total sales amount. And then we can also see information on managers, salesmen, and the regions corresponding to each item here. Then we follow with two charts here. First one is the vertical bar chart. The second one is the horizontal bar chart. With the help of these two charts, we can see that in the first chart, when we consider the sales amount, television is the highest selling product because it is bringing in the highest sales amount here. Whereas with respect to the units sold, we can see that home theater is the top selling product here. So when we use different graphs, when we analyze data from different dimensions, we can get more insights here. The third unit of analysis was manager. So again, this table gives a breakdown of the region and the number of salesmen for each manager, how many units were sold, and what was the total sales amount generated for each manager. With the help of pie chart and a 3D pie chart here, we can see that Martha is the best performing manager because she accounts for almost 36% of sale amount and also 33% of all the units sold. Finally, we have information broken down by salesman. So we can see who is the manager for each salesman, the region in which each of those salesmen is operating, and the number of items and how many units were sold and what was the total sales amount generated by each salesman. With the use of vertical and horizontal bar charts again, we can see that Alexander is the best performing salesman with respect to both the total sales amount generated and also the total number of units sold. Next, we can do analysis with respect to quarters. That is, we can see how we performed across different regions by quarter and how are the sales for different items by quarter for each of those regions. By using the order date, we create a new column which identifies the quarter in which that given order falls. And using that quarterly information, we can create these next charts here. So the first chart shows the sales for different regions by quarter. So we are comparing different regions for each of the quarters here. This is called a clustered vertical bar chart. We can see from this chart that central region is performing exceedingly well and it had the highest sales in the second quarter. You could also see that perhaps West is not performing as well, as good as the other regions. It did comparatively okay in the first two quarters of 2018, but then the sales just dropped in the subsequent quarters. The second graph here shows the sales for different items by quarter. This is called a vertical stacked bar chart because we have stacked different items here for each of the quarters. So using this graph, we can see that television is the highest selling amount with respect to the sales amount. The next chart here is called clustered horizontal bar chart. Here we have clustered different managers, that is, we are comparing them side by side for each quarter. Looking at this graph, we can see that Martha is probably the best performing manager because she is consistent across different quarters and her sales amount are consistently above average. You could also see that Herman had the highest sales among all the managers across all quarters. You could also see who are the managers who are not doing as well, and probably we could work with them to see how we can improve their performance. The last chart here is again a stacked horizontal bar chart here. So this shows how each salesman performed across different quarters. So we have stacked different quarters for each salesman. This might give some information, but again, this is not as good of a graph as the previous graph here. So probably we can again ignore this graph in our final analysis. But it's always a good practice to start with as much comprehensive analysis as possible, as many different graphs as we can, because once we look at them, only after that we can clearly identify which ones are most useful and which ones are not most useful. Now let's go back to our Excel and see how we can put together this report. So we'll leave the first sheet as it is. We should always have a copy of the raw data as is, because if we mess up our data during our analysis, we will always have the original copy to go back and refer to. So let's create a new sheet here, and I'm going to name this sheet as analysis. And then let's copy this data. All right. Now we have an exact copy of the data, and we can start working on this. So before we start with any analysis, let's try to identify the header column and give some style to the header column so that it stands out from the rest of the data. So select the first cell here, and if we press Ctrl Shift and right arrow, all the cells with values would be selected. Now let's go to cell styles group here and just choose a random style. All right. Once we have this, let's freeze the top row, because with that, even if we scroll up and down here, our header column would be fixed. That way we'll always know what column we are looking at. All right, I think the first step here is to calculate the total sale amount. So let's create a column called sale amount here. So the total sale amount for a given order would be the product of number of units sold by the price for each of those units. Hit enter. If we double click here, that formula should be applied to all the subsequent cells. Okay. Now, in order to clearly identify that the columns G and H are dollar amounts, let's select these two columns, go to our Home tab here and choose the dollar sign. So that converts that into currency. Okay, so once we have here, the first part of our report was the summary section. So we need to identify what were the total units that we sold, what was the total sale amount, and all that stuff. So let's start with the units first. Let's create a total units sold cell here. Let's just give a different formatting so that it stands out from the calculated value. If we double click on this, the column width would adjust to accommodate the entire text typed in that column. In order to find the total number of units, we'll use the sum function here. So we'll just say sum, open brackets, and choose the first cell in the units column. Use Ctrl Shift and down arrow. All the cells with values in that column would be selected. Let's close the brackets. So whatever formula we are typing, we can see that in this formula tab as well. Hit enter. Now we get the total units sold. Let's also find out the average units sold. To calculate the average, we will use average function. Average, again, choose the first cell. Let's see. Let's try this again. So equal to average, choose the first cell, Control Shift and down arrow, close the brackets, hit enter. Oh, something wrong here. F2 to F44, that should have worked. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. Now since the number of units sold should always be a whole number, because practically we can't be selling 0.3 of a unit or 0.5 of a unit. So we'll round it up here. We'll use a function called round. Choose the number that we need to round. So if we see here, Excel suggests the number of the different values that we need to give for this function. So the first one is the number that we are trying to round, which is F51, followed by we need to mention how many digits do we want the number to be rounded to. Since we don't want any numbers after the decimal point, we'll just give 0 here. All right, now we see that the average units are rounded to 49. Next, let's calculate the highest units sold in an order. calculate the highest value in a range of cells, we'll use a function called max here. Then select the first cell, Control Shift and down arrow. There we have. Next, let's find out the lowest units sold. To find out the lowest value, we will use the min function. So minimum, choose the first cell, Control Shift down arrow. All right, let's repeat the same steps for the sale amount. Let's find out the total sale amount. Again, we'll use the function sum here. Let's choose the first cell, Control Shift and down arrow. Okay. Next, we'll calculate the average sale amount. We'll use the average function, give the cell range. Let's see. Okay, I think there's something wrong with my Mac, but I hope it behaves well for the rest of the video here. All right, so let's find out the highest sale amount. Let's select these two cells by pressing the command key. So on Mac, we'll use command key to make multiple selections, but on Windows, you can use control key. Let's go to cell styles. There we go. Again, to find the highest sale amount, let's use max function. Give the cell range. The lowest sale amount, we'll use the min function. All right. All right, there we go. Okay, so once we have this, the next steps are to, let's go back to our report. The next steps are to start creating these tables here, because once we have these tables, then we'll go about creating our charts and graphs here. So let's start by creating the table for regions. All right. So we'll have to find out how many unique regions do we have. So for that, we'll use the function called unique. And let's give the range of cells in this column. All right, there we have our different regions. Let's repeat this for the other entities too. Let's say managers. Okay. Let's use the unique function again. Give the range of cells from the manager column. All right. Next, we'll move on to salesman. All right, let's see. Let me redo this again. Shift and down arrow. All right, there we have. And finally, let's find out how many items do we have. But before that, let's see how many salesmen do we have. We could count manually, but if we have more values, it might not be a smart way to do that. So let's just use some functions here and let's have Excel do the hard work for us. So in order to count the number of entries in a given list, we can use the count A function. Count A function here because we are counting text or words. So count A, let's give the range of cells. Or we could use another function called rows function that also counts how many rows or how many values do we have in our range. Okay, and finally let's get the unique items that we have in the data set. Okay, so we're done with the first part here. Now we'll start to fill out each of these tables. Okay, so for the region table, we need to find out the number of managers, the number of salesmen, items, and all such. So let's try to create this headers first. Number of managers, salesmen, regions, number of items, total units sold, and sales amount. Let's give some formatting to these cells as well. Okay, let's increase the width of these columns. Let's double click here and then the column will auto size according to the content. All right, so to find out the number of managers in a given region, there are multiple, we have to take multiple steps here, right? So the first step would be to find out how many managers do we have in Eastern region, or to find out the different managers in Eastern region. So we can see here that for the Eastern region, Martha is one manager. Martha repeats again here. We have Martha one more time, and then we see Douglas here, right? So the first step is to identify the managers listed for the Eastern region, okay? That would be the first step. So once we get a list of the managers, let's try to see with an example. So we have Martha once, twice, thrice. So we see Martha one more time, and then we see Douglas. So let's just repeat that. Douglas, and let's copy paste Douglas one more time. Okay, so the first step would be, this is just a sample of the different managers for the Eastern region, right? So the first step would be to identify all the rows for the Eastern region and then identifying the names of those managers. Okay, so that would be the first step here. But after we get this, we see that we have duplicate entries, right? Like Martha is repeated at least 4 or 5 times. So we don't want to count Martha that many times. So in order to get only unique values, we will use the unique function here. So once we use the unique function, then our result would be only these two. Okay. So in order to filter out only by the Eastern region, we'll use the filter function here. Next, once we get the data only for the Eastern region, in order to get only the unique entries, we use the unique function. So once we have the unique entries here, then we need to count how many unique entries do we have. That's when we use the count A function. Okay, so after using the count A function on these two unique entries, our result would be 2. So I hope this is clear. So that's what we'll try to use here. All right, so we have to count, what do we have to count here? The unique values of what? unique values that are obtained after filtering the managers. So let's give the cell range for the managers here. After filtering the managers for what region? So we'll give a comma. After filtering the managers based on what? So we want to filter the managers based on the regions. So we'll select the region column here. Okay. And again, for which region do we have to filter? That's where we give our region name. Okay. So that's our formula, right? So we are counting the unique values of what? Unique values that are obtained after filtering the managers for the region, specifically for the eastern region, which is mentioned in cell J3. Okay, so that's our formula here. Let's close the brackets, hit enter, and there we have the number of managers for the eastern region. All right. Now if we try to just drag down this formula for the next two regions here, we do get the correct values here, but as we can see, for the first cell, we are taking the cell range from C2 to C44 and B2 to B44, but if we go to the central region, the cell range has shifted from C2 to C3 and B2 to B3. It's because Excel by default uses relative reference, right? So in this case, it works out fine, but in some cases where if we had central region in the first row, then it wouldn't be counted here, right? So in order to always consider our cells from the starting point, we'll make these as relative references. So we'll go to the first usage of the formula here, and then we'll just fix the row position. Okay, so $2, wherever we place the dollar sign, that's what we are fixing it. So I have the dollar sign before 2, that means we are fixing the starting point to be the second row. Then let's keep a dollar sign before 44, dollar sign here, and then again here. Let's hit enter. Again, in this case, it worked out fine even without the dollar sign, but it's always a best practice to use absolute references wherever possible. Next, we'll use the similar logic for the salesman too. So even for the salesman, first we have to filter out the salesman for a given region. So after we filter out, then we have to only get the unique values. And after we get the unique values, then we'll have to count those unique values here. Okay, similar to how we understood using this example. So we'll count the unique values which were obtained by filtering the salesman for the region specific to the region that is mentioned over here. Okay, let's close these brackets here, hit enter, and there we have 3 salesmen. Again, let's make the references absolute. We'll use a dollar sign here. And same thing for the region column as well. Now let's apply this for the other 2 regions as well. There we have. We'll repeat the same thing for, yeah, I don't think we don't need this. This doesn't make sense for regions, so let's just delete this. Okay, there we have. And I'm going to delete this example as well. All right, so let's find out the number of items that are being sold in each region. So again, count unique, filter the items for the regions that are specified in this position here. All right, let's close the brackets. Before we hit enter, let's make the references absolute. All right. Let's drag this down and apply to the other two regions as well. Now we have the number of items sold in each region. Okay. Now for the units sold function, we have to use SUMIF function, right? Because for each region, we want to add how many units were sold. Okay. So we'll use SUMIFs here. Just SUMIF because we have only one condition, like we just want to sum based upon the region. So only one condition here. So SUMIF if the region is equal to the eastern region, and what do we need to sum here? We need to sum the total units. So let's give that cell range here. All right. Again, we'll make these as absolute references because for every region we want the sum to start from the beginning because we don't know in which position each of the region is starting. All right. Hit enter. There we have our quantity. Let's drag this down and apply to other regions as well. Since we have used absolute references, this should work out fine. All right, we'll repeat the same process for the sales amount as well. So again, since we want to sum up all the sales amount for each different region, we'll again use a SUMIF function here. SUMIF the region is equal to the region specified here, and if the region is equal to this, what do we need to sum? The sale amount. Again, let's make the references absolute. All right, hit enter. We should have our sale amount. Let's drag this down and change the data type here. Okay, now we are done with the first entity here. So for the region, we have the number of managers, salesmen, items, and the summation of units sold and the sales amount. Let's repeat this for the managers too. So for the manager, we need to know the number of regions, the number of salesmen that we have, number of items that are being sold, let's apply the same font throughout. Okay, and we would also need information about units sold followed by the sales amount. All right, we'll use the same functions that we have used earlier to find out the number of regions for Martha, number of salesmen, etc. because it's the same concept here, right? So in order to find out in how many regions each manager is working, we would have to filter out the records, or we would have to filter out the records where Martha is the manager. So once we filter out, then we'll have to get the region for the corresponding manager, and once we have the region list, then we have to take only unique entries because as we have seen, we can have duplicate entries. Once we have the unique entries, then we will use count a function to get the count of the unique entries. Okay, so count a unique filter. What are we trying to filter here? To filter the region, so where the manager is equal to Martha. So before we execute this, let's make the references absolute. All right, let's Let's drag and apply this. There we have the number of regions in which each of the manager is working. Okay. Similarly, let's find out the number of salesmen under each manager. So we will count the unique values that were obtained after filtering the salesmen for manager whose value is equal to this one. Let's close the brackets. Let's make the references absolute. Alright, there we have the salesman working under Martha. Drag this down, we get the salesman working under other managers. Next, applying the similar logic to identify how many different items each manager is responsible for. So here we have to filter the items. For each of the managers. The value of the manager is given in this column. Okay. Let's drag this down. All right. So here we can see that we are making the cell references absolute for the items and manager, but the actual name of the manager is not absolute because we want that to change with each manager, right? So for the first manager, the manager name is in cell J8, which is Martha. And if we go to the second manager here, the cell references are still the same. We're always starting from the starting point here, but as we can see, the cell reference for the manager name changed, and that's what we want. For this here, we want the name to be considered as Herman here, so this works out well. All right. Again, in order to get the units sold and sale amount, we'll use the SUMIF functions here. So SUMIF the manager is equal to SUMIF the manager is Martha, and if the manager is Martha, for that particular record, what are we trying to sum here? We are trying to sum the number of units sold. So let's give the cell range for the units column. Let's close the brackets here. Again, let's make the references absolute. All right. Again, we are not making the manager name absolute here. It's just J8 because we want it to change with each manager as we go down. So let's drag this down, and there we have. Let's finish the manager section by summing the, sorry, not county, we need to use the SUMIF function. SUMIF the manager is equal to Martha, then sum the total sale amount. All right. Again, let's make the references absolute. Yep, I did something wrong here. Oh, it's not SUMIFs, it should be SUMIF. All right, SUMIFs is a function which we use when we have multiple criteria, but here we have only one criteria. Like we only want to check whether the manager is Martha or not, and then sum the amount. We don't have two conditions. We only have one condition, so we should only use SUMIF and not if. So let me fix this formula here. All right, there we go. Let's drag this down. Okay, and give the $sign. All right, let's finish this up for salesman, manager, identify which region each salesman is working in, how many items they are responsible for, what were the units sold, total sale amount generated. Again, we have to count the unique values that are obtained after filtering. No, I'm going ahead of myself. So that's not the formula here, right? I'm sorry. So here for salesman, we need to identify who the manager is, right? So if we see here, we have salesman and then we have the manager column here. So we need to find out who is the manager for a given salesman. Actually, before we finish the salesman, let's finish the items table, because we look at VLOOKUP in the items table, and then we'll look different application of VLOOKUP in the salesman table. So let's just finish the items portion first. So for the items, we need to get the price of each item, the units sold, sales amount, number of managers, salesmen, and number of regions in which each of the item is being sold. All right. So here we'll use a function called VLOOKUP, because we have to get the price for each item, right? So it's basically we just have to find a match here, that is in the items column we have to find wherever item occurs, the first match where item occurs, and then corresponding to that we need to find what is the value in a different column. Okay, so we need to find for a match in the main column, and wherever that match occurs in that row we need to find a different value in a different column. Okay, so here we need to find out where television occurs, and once we get the location of that row, in that row we can go to the unit price column and get the value for each television. Okay, so VLOOKUP function helps us do that to get the price of television. So we are trying to look up the word television, and we need to give the range of the cells in which we have our lookup value and the corresponding value that we are trying to obtain for our television, right? So that would be from this point. No, actually we don't need the header names. Okay, all right, so we can use VLOOKUP function here to match the occurrence of television in the items column, and then wherever we find that match we can pick up corresponding value from the unit price column. All right, so we need to mention where is the value that we are trying to look up, and we need to give the range of cells in which we have both our value that we are trying to match and the unit price that we are trying to look up. Okay, so that is from E to G. So we need to give this entire range. Okay, so we select this first cell, Control Shift, or let's just select these three here, then Control Shift down arrow. So all these would be selected. That would be the range in which we have both of our values, right? First one is the value that we have to look up, and the next one is the price that we are looking up for. So you can see here I did not select all these cells, so let's fix this. So E2 to G44. Now we can see that this entire portion is selected. Okay, so once we give the range in which we have both our values, Then we have to mention what is the location of the column. So now we can see in this range from E2 to G44, we have 3 columns, right? So we have to mention in which column do we have to look for the value, right? So here it is the third column. So this is the first, second, and third column. So here we should say 3, the position of the column. Okay. And after that, we should give one more value for VLOOKUP. So it says, do you want an approximate match or an exact match? So what approximate match does is, here we have television, so it works out fine. So television, it will match with television. So what if we had only tele here, the word just tele, right? So if we use an approximate match here, if we say true, so Excel will do an approximate match. That is, even if you have tele here, it will still match with television because a portion of it is being matched, right? So that's approximate match. But here we'll just go ahead and use an exact match. So when we use exact match, it will look for the exact sequence of alphabets in the column. Okay, so let's just say false here. We are looking for exact match. Hit enter. Now we see our price. Okay, now again, the only thing that we have to make absolute here is the position of this cell in our table range. So let's fix that. And once we have that, we can drag and apply this to all the other units. Okay, let's go and cross check this. So for television, the unit price is 1198. For home theater, the value is 500. Cell phone, it's 225. Desk, it's 125. For video games, it's 58.5. So it looks like that worked out all right. Next, let's find out the total units sold here. Again, to find the total units sold, we will use SUMIF. So SUMIF, the item is equal to television. And what do we have to sum here? The total units sold. So let's give this cell range. Again, let's make the rows as absolute here, so that for every item we are considering the entire range of values. All right, let's drag this down, and while we are here, let's give a dollar sign to this so that we can clearly know that's a dollar amount. Similarly, for sales amount, let's use the SUMIF function again. So SUMIF television, what are we trying to sum here? We are trying to sum the sale amount. So Control Shift and down arrow. Again, let's make the references absolute. All right, there we have it. Let's drag this down and let's change the type of data to currency. So to find the number of managers, it's the 3-step process, right, that we saw above here, where we were using a count A function, filter, and unique. Okay, so we'll again use a combination of those 3 functions here. So count the unique values that were obtained after filtering. What are we trying to filter here? Managers, because we want to count the number of managers. So filtering the managers where the item is equal to television. Let's close the brackets and let's make the references absolute. All right. Let's apply this to other items as well. And now we have the number of managers responsible for each of those items. Similarly, we'll get the number of salesmen responsible for each item. So let's use the combination of these functions again. Unique filter. We are trying to filter salesmen here. Based on the items. Let's make this cell references absolute, or rather the row positions absolute. Alright, there we have the number of salesmen responsible for each item. Similarly, let's obtain the number of regions in which each of the item is being sold. Alright. Okay, so we are trying to filter the regions where the item is equal to television. Just making this a row references absolute here. All right. Okay, there we have our region information. Now let's go back to our salesman table, and let's try to fill this up. Okay. So the first step here is to try to find out who the manager is for a given salesman, right? So we'll again use VLOOKUP here, but then VLOOKUP only works well if the value that we are looking for is on the right hand side of our value that we are trying to match. That is, we have sales column, D is our salesman column, whereas C is the manager column. So C is on the left side of D. So VLOOKUP won't work properly in that case, because we want to look up who the manager is for Alexander, right? So the value that we are looking up is on the left side to the column in which we have the value that we want to match here. Okay, so for that reason we will still use VLOOKUP, but then we have to use a slight variation of it. We have to use a new function called choose here. Let's see how that works. So we'll use VLOOKUP. So we are trying to look up value for this. Okay, so we have to flip the position of these two columns, flip the position of column C and D, because again VLOOKUP needs the columns to be in certain order here, right? So in order to flip the position of these two columns in memory, we'll use a function called choose here, right? Choose, we will say like we want to choose two columns, 1 and 2, okay? And the values that we want in our first column are in the salesman, right? Because we want the salesman column to be positioned first. So we'll give the range of values for the salesman, followed by what do we want in the second column here? We want the managers. So let's give the range of values for the managers in the second column. All right, that's it. That's all we have to do here for the choose function. So what this does is, what choose function does is, in memory, it will flip these two functions. So it will put salesman before manager, and that's what it will provide to VLOOKUP function. So once we have that in place, VLOOKUP will function as usual. All right, so we have those two columns there. Now we have to tell VLOOKUP in this hypothesized table in memory where these two columns are flipped, where do we have our manager column? Okay, in which column are we looking for a value? So we are looking for in the second column, right? Because remember, with 1 2 here, these two are flipped. So for us, in the one position we have salesman, and in the second position we have manager. So that's why we give 2 here. And then we'll say 0. So we can either use 0 or false for exact match. If we want to use true, we can use 1 or true. All right, so 0 and 1 are Boolean values which represent either false or true respectively. Let's close this, and now we should have the manager name for our salesman. All right, that's it. So let's go ahead and make this cell references absolute. Okay, let's drag this down and we get the managers for each of our salesmen. Let's just cross check whether we got these values correctly or not. So for Alexander, we see Martha is the manager. For Shelley, we have Herman. For Louise, we have Herman. Timothy, or sorry, for David, we have Timothy. Stephen, we have Timothy as well. Stephen, Martha, for Michael. Michael, we have Douglas. Okay, that's true. For Seigel, we have Herman. Diana, Martha again. Karen is Douglas. John is Douglas. Okay, it's always, we should always make sure that we are cross-checking our work to make sure that our formulas are working as expected. All right. So the similar approach for region as well, because if we see here, we are trying to find out in which region each salesman is working. Again, region is on the left hand side for the salesman column. So here as well, we'll have to use the choose function to flip the position of the columns. Okay, so we'll use VLOOKUP. The value is in here, and then we'll use choose function here. What do we want to go into the first column? We want to have the salesman values. Sorry, I have to mention the number of columns. All right, so in the first column, we want the salesman values here. And in the second column, I want the region values. So our table in memory is created here. And then we have to tell VLOOKUP in which column should we look up for the region value. That's in our second column now after flipping, right? So 2, again, we want an exact match. So we'll use 0 here, hit enter. But before we do that, let's make this reference as absolute. Okay, so we got the region values. Let's drag this across. And now we have the region value in which each of our salesmen is working. Next, let's find out the number of items for each salesman. So for this one, we'll go back to using our chain of functions here. Count A, unique, filter. What are we trying to filter here? We are trying to filter our items for the salesman whose value is equal to this one. Okay, let's close the brackets. Let's make the cell reference as absolute. All right, there we have the number of items for each salesman. Okay, let's move on to the next things here. Now we have to sum the total units sold by each salesman and the total sales amount for each salesman. Okay, so we'll use the SUMIF function here. So SUMIF the salesman is equal to this one, and if the salesman matches this value, what do we have to sum up here? For the number of units, we have to sum up these values. Let's start from the first cell. All right, there we have our setup. Let's make the cell references absolute again. Okay, so now we have the total number of units sold by Alexander. Let's apply this to the remaining cells here. We have values for all the other salesmen as well. Let's finish the final column here. Again, count A, filter, oh sorry, oh my bad, not count A here, we have to sum, right? So we will use the SUMIF function. SUMIF, okay, SUMIF the salesman is equal to this value. Whenever that matches, sum the corresponding sales amount. Okay. Let's not forget to make the rows absolute here. So once we have that, press enter. All right, we have the sale amount. Let's apply this to the remaining salesmen, and we have the sales amount generated by each salesman. Okay, so there we have. All right, so I think we've finished the major part of this report here. So we have all the tables generated.